I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello everyone!
Everybody.
What is this episode about? Watch to find out what happens next. So, today we're going to talk about the gaming philosophy, mainly for tabletop role-playing games, but you know what? You can use it in other games too, that is play to find out what happens next. Now, this is most well-known for being just literally written into the rules of Apocalypse World. Therefore, it's heavily integrated into the DNA of Powered by the Apocalypse games and games inspired by them, such as Blades in the Dark and the Forged in the Dark games, or even Daggerheart, which recently came out. So, this video is intended for you, especially if you are a D&D or Pathfinder player who plays game systems that do not explicitly have a play to find out what happens philosophy written in the core rules, and in fact might have pre-published adventures that very much veer away from that direction. Mm-hmm. So we're going to start by defining what this philosophy is. Then we will move on by showing how the games that are built from the ground up with this philosophy integrated in. And then we'll end by delivering our empowerment promise and showing you how you can use this philosophy to improve and enrich your games in D&D and Pathfinder. Even if this is not an episode that says, hey, you have to switch to game systems that are using this philosophy. It's about how you can use this philosophy no matter what you want to play.
So I think, to some extent, with a D&D or Pathfinder game, there is going to be some amount of player interaction and randomness that are going to drive things in a way that the GM didn't necessarily fully script ahead of time. But play to find out takes things to a much greater level.
Yes. So play to find out what happens. Basically, the philosophy means what you might think it does on the tin, which is that nobody knows what happens. That's an implication of that. Nobody knows in advance. It's not something that the player wrote a 50-page backstory that explains everything that's going to happen. It's not something where the GM has plotted things out or has bought a pre-published adventure that has a point A to point B to point C to point D, even if it allows some freedom and flexibility of how you get there, but it's always known you're not going to skip this 30-page dungeon that's in the book. You're definitely getting to that dungeon, whether it's a complete railroad or a narrow broad framework, or a roller coaster, or whatever you want to call it. D&D and Pathfinder adventures often are like that, with set pieces that you're always going to run into, no matter how flexible it is at certain points in the plot line.
And you also have a sense that when you go to a location, the GM's probably figured out what's in that location in advance. They probably know what the monsters are. They probably know what the treasures are. They probably know what the challenges are that the PCs are going to face. They may not know the exact order that the PCs are going to face them in. They might not know if the PCs are going to enter from the front or sneak in the side window, but they know generally what's going to be in each room, and so therefore they have a good sense of what the overall structure is going to be and
That's
objectives.
Right. So the philosophy of play to find out what happens next essentially means that the players and the GM did not predetermine ahead of time what was going to happen in the game. It is a natural consequence of the back and forth between the GM asking questions and prompting the players to take action, the players saying what their characters will do, and the GM reacting as the world, the antagonist or deuteragonist, other things that live in the story of the world, making a natural response to what the players' actions would be. Mm-hmm. So this is essentially one of many types of non-railroady style of campaign. There are ways to do a non-railroaded campaign that actually is not like this, where you either have a ton of stuff you pre-prepared for a sandbox and it's just like, well, I've created these 50 hexes and I know exactly what will happen in each of these hexes, but I don't know where they're going to go. That's generally not considered a railroad. It's also not really all the way into play to find out what happens next, because you sort of are finding out which hex they decided to go to, but within that, it's all very constrained.
It's also not typically a thing that is just generated by random tables.
Yes. While I would imagine that the philosophy of play to find out what happens next is not anathematic to random tables, most of the RPGs that call upon it don't tend to use random tables heavily for how they do things. Now, you could if you don't know what you're going to do, but it tends to be that, and in the spirit of Apocalypse World, which had a very in-your-face style writing for the GM, where it would just be like telling you harshly that you better do like the accurate correcting for the world, or you're cheating your players, and it was just like a very tongue-in-cheekly confrontational, because like the actual people who wrote it are not like in-your-face confrontational people, but they did it on purpose to sort of get that tone across, where it was like, no, you will do it right. You're not going to let your players off the hook, but you're also not going to do anything unfairly too much to them. You have to do it right. You're going to play to find it out, what happens next. So when you're following that philosophy, but you don't have to follow it like in a purist way. You can still think about what it means and why it's there. So why is that philosophy there? What is it intending to encourage? So in general, the play to find out what happens next, the idea of it is that it allows you to have a natural back and forth where the player's choices always matter and they always drive the action. And the action is always driven towards what the players and the GM thinks is interesting. Mm-hmm.
Because, if you have a pre-written adventure, and this is why I had the railroad on the thumbnail with a little X over it. If you have an adventure and you're trying to get the players to the dungeon, then you're always going to have, as the GM, in the back of your mind, like, okay, what clues might bring them onto the path of the adventure? Or, even if you decide, okay, it's clear they're not going to go to this dungeon, as we've talked about in previous episodes, you might be thinking about how might I reuse pieces of this dungeon elsewhere because I've spent all this time to prep. But there's often like, because I've bought this adventure, because I've spent this time to prep. Whereas with Play to Find Out, the idea is that you're not going to really spend your energy planning something until you need it in the moment, because that's what the players were focused on.
That's right.
And by the same token, you might see the system actively discouraging the players from spending tons of time making a strategy in advance, like with Blades in the Dark, where the system is like, it's a dynamic heist. You're not going to be sitting there being like, yes, let's plan for 20 minutes how we're going to enter. You just have a very vague sense of a rough approach, and then you figure things out as you go along.
By the way, Play to Find Out what happens next does not mean you cannot do any preparation before the game, and it doesn't mean you can't have a pre-published scenario. It does mean that they don't look the same as the ones that you're used to finding in D&D or Pathfinder. And for that reason, since Linda was already bringing in some good points about some of the ways that, for instance, Blades in the Dark uses this philosophy, let's take a look at how some of those styles of adventures design actually wind up looking. So they are a type of adventure that can and does exist sometimes in D&D. In fact, the old AD&D villain handbook described the types of adventure that work well in a Play to Find Out what happens next system, often as being power matrices, they called them, or sometimes a time matrix if they're a little less complicated. What those tended to be were just like a list of actors who have their own agenda. They have what they want to do. You know what they're going to do if they're not stopped. That may even allow you to put it on a clock. And as the PCs take time doing things, you're like, okay, well, this gets to the next point in the clock, and that means that these bad guys have done this next thing on their scheme. And then, assuming the PCs try to interact with this in some way, which is likely, at least one of the plots they will, then you just kind of adjudicate it on the fly, depending on whatever the PC's actions are. Those kind of scenarios can and will be written into pre-published adventures for those styles of systems, where they can give you a very intricate setup situation. And they might even include something that you might think of as akin to a dungeon, if there are dungeon delving or like those kind of mechanics in the game system. For instance, if you're running this in D&D, there definitely are. They could have one and be like, yeah, you know what? this is for if the PCs decide they're going to go attack these guys who are causing problems. It's likely you might need it at some point, but you might not. So just don't use this if they don't go there.
So you could still have like here's the boss, here's like kind of here's roughly how they work. Here's maybe a general idea of the kinds of minions they might have, but you're not going to be like, yes, in room B3 there are 7 minions.
That's right. So the way that these systems use this philosophy is to have a lot more of a sort of breezy back and forth between the players and the GM, where the spotlight shifts, somebody takes an action, and there's a counter response depending on how they did at that action. But actions have these not necessarily equal but opposite reactions, but the reactions do come from the action in this sort of almost, it's a back and forth. It has a rhythm, and it's very specific. And Math Guy Dave said in chat something that I wanted to bring up here that's very important. Math Guy Dave says that it's a challenge for Math Guy and for Daggerheart for players who are used to traditional D&D adventures. So absolutely. One of the number one ways you can tell, and I said at the beginning, we're not going to tell you need to play these style of games. They are cool. I think it's worth trying them to see if you can flex some different muscles and maybe level up as a GM or a player. But if what we just described to you sounds like it's like, oh my gosh, that's like impossible, or that would be really hard, it still might be worth it to try it just to see if you can get better at it. But it also might suggest that these styles of system will be very difficult for you. If it's just like, what do you mean? I'm just supposed to make up whatever a response is to what they're doing. That's not my strength. Like
it's more improvisational. So if that's your, if improv is something that you like to do and that you're good at doing, or something that you're looking at practicing, one of the things that it does bring with it is that because you're not preparing lots of stuff in advance, you're not going to be sinking time into things that players aren't going to do. And players, on the flip side, are not going to be spending time investigating something only to find out that it's a dead end. The fact that players took interest in a thing makes it something that is relevant.
Right. However, it's not just very improvisational. It is a specific improv skill. There are some GMs I know who are very good at certain types of improv. They can just give you a conversation with an NPC on the spot without really having prepared it, and they'll talk to you for an hour as that NPC. It'll be fine. A big conversation with the whole party, multiple NPCs, and it'll be great. But they still might not be able to do that very specific back and forth where it has to not only be shifting the spotlight just right and responding, but it needs to give a commensurate response that is appropriately negative at the right times to move the action, but also even when they're given the option by the system, it's some kind of move against the players, but it could be a soft one or a harsher one. It's sometimes softer, and you don't exactly know what that's going to be, and you have to figure it out.
Generally,
for some GMs, that even that are good at other improv skills, that is tricky. And for others, it just is so natural. They're like, I just do this, and I just feel it in my gut, and I know what that's going to be for our group. In fact, many of those systems don't even try to give you any guidelines on it, because they even say, Blades in the Dark, right in the instructions, they're like, we're not going to, because your groups is going to be different than any other groups, and you'll figure it out on your own. Whereas others, like Daggerheart, do have some rules of thumb. They don't completely lead you all the way, but they're like, we have this way that you can take control as the GM, and it's a point system, and you're going to probably have this gigantic bank of them because there's so many ways that you gain them. And so you could theoretically at an encounter spend 30 if you have 30, but we think that if it's a low stakes encounter that you should spend no more than 5 on average. You'll know if you need to spend more because something weird happens. It's something like that, which frankly, honestly, I think is a great thing. And I'm not saying that Blades in the Dark was bad for not having it, something like that. But for me, my absolute preference is, here's a rule of thumbish thing that we were thinking of that's loose. And also, you figure out the rest, and you don't need to follow this, as opposed to just no, I'm not telling you anything. Figure it out.
Because then you have at least some anchor to get an idea of vaguely what it's talking about and then modify from there.
And we've even, if you watch our episode in Blades in the Dark, we love Blades in the Dark, and we talked a lot about how great it is, but we said the one potential sticking point for some groups, for some GMs, is exactly this skill set that you kind of have to develop, and you are thrown into the deep end a bit. So, let's say you don't flinch back at this skill set, or you say, no, I am weak at this, but I'm going to get stronger. I want to try it. But your group is like, what? Apocalypse World? What? Blades in the Dark? What? Dagger? No. We want to play D&D or Pathfinder. You can absolutely still use this philosophy and get used to building this muscle up a little bit, so that if you later want to play any of those systems or just keep playing D&D and Pathfinder, you'll have this in your toolbox. Here's how. Linda actually unlocked the one of the most important parts of it earlier in the episode. Build a toolbox of parts that you can use. Unlike before in our other episodes on contingency plans, where it's like, well, you expected this, but you can, as a contingency, throw it in there. No. When you're doing this, because you're in a rules-heavy system where you can't just be like, okay, they found this weird monster I've never thought of before, I instantly have it.
Yeah.
You won't instantly have it. So build a spare parts folder that's full of stuff that just you think is cool and that is not so specific that you wouldn't be able to use it in a variety of places.
I would recommend also looking at sort of template style things, which are, adjustments that you can throw on top of existing stat blocks to modify them in the way that you want. Like, if you have an organization and their shtick is that they wield fire whips, and then you come up with like fire whip style or whatever, and a few basic things with that, then you can throw on top of like existing stat blocks for bandits and other creatures to quickly on the fly create what you need to do.
To go along with Linda's example, let's say the fire whip organization, the one thing you know is that the fire whip organization is opening up a hole into the sun, and fire monsters are pouring out, and it's called like the Rain of Fire.
Yeah.
And the PCs, I mean, they might not try to stop that. And maybe they're just decide, even though you think they're going to be heroes who are going to stop that they're scoundrels who just want to get out with their money and escape the Rain of Fire, and hopefully it won't burn up the world.
Yeah.
Whatever the PCs do, you still know there's going to be a lot of these fire things. So making a fiery version of other creatures, like a template that you can put on an adjustment for fire, could be a good move. You can also come up with like just basic floor plans for dungeons that you haven't figured out what it is. It just kind of looks interesting.
Yeah.
That you can use in a pinch if you need to.
I think that it also is easier to work with if you're using Theater of the Mind, so you don't have to have a fully, like, this is the exact dimensions of the rooms of the dungeon, these are the exact features and things like that, and you can come up with things a little bit more.
Of course.
Step by step.
But if you can't handle Theater of the Mind, which many people cannot in Pathfinder or D&D, it just depends on your group. We like Theater of the Mind here. It's okay to get maps in advance. Make them, or you know what? Paizo has a bunch of flip maps, whether you're a Pathfinder player or not, that you can just buy. There's also a lot of great cartographers online who have really good deals for like things like Patreons, where you support them and they give you a bunch of maps.
Absolutely.
That you're like, I don't know what I'm gonna do with these really awesome maps, but I you back them for long enough, it's like I have several hundred. And
then there you go.
Once you have that library, you're ready for a lot of things. Now, you don't have to be somebody who backed 100 maps to run in this style.
You can also, there's also like free online dungeon map generators that you can use. And another strategy you might use is kind of ball and stick until it matters, where you draw like just a basic sketch with circles and lines that show how rooms connect. So you're keeping track of how the layout is, and then when a combat happens or something where the exact dimensions of the room matter, then you can throw down the map for that room.
That's right. And it's you know what? It won't kill you if a few of the rooms are basic, mostly rectangular rooms that you just throw in the objects that have to be there based on your description.
It's exactly what Matt Guy said. You can play in a blank map with some simple lines drawn.
Yep, same thing. Now, Rohit brought up a really good point in chat for a question that is, really, the fact that Rohit is asking this question means that he's deeply engaging with this topic, but also it reveals a sort of a secret trap for D&D and Pathfinder players in using this philosophy. So Rohit said, what if the player response is too unexpected and it's in a direction the GM doesn't want? So, the answer from play to find out what happens is, there is no direction the GM doesn't want.
Because the GM does not decide
what the direction is. It'll be based on what the players are doing. And these systems often say that like you're a fan of the players and their characters. You're here to like watch them do and try to do what they want to do. And so this doesn't mean you have to be this suddenly selfless being who has no say and no opinions. Obviously, there's going to be some lines that you draw, possibly at session 0, where like of directions where it's like, I do not want this to go into like people torturing other people. Yeah. No, like let's.
You may have like
not
content.
You might have content-based
or things
gates,
like that. Yeah.
And you might also have a preference, even though in these systems they would discourage you from doing this. I think it's fine if you're just like, I can respond to that and we can go there, but I think it would be really cool if you went this other way. In fact, some of those systems have mechanics for doing that in certain ways. For instance, there's something called the Devil's Bargain in Blades in the Dark, where you could give something to the players in exchange for something that you think would be cool. It's usually also supposed to be like somewhat bad or raise the complications for them. But it could just be, sometimes I've seen players take it when they didn't really need the mechanical boost, but because they also thought that the thing that made it more complicated for them was awesome.
Yeah.
And one of the examples in the rulebook, I think, is just like they're trying to get a guard, like someone from the Watch, since you're in Blades in the Dark, you're criminals, to like do what they want or look the other way or something like that. And the GM is like, I'll give you a Devil's Bargain since it looks like your chances are okay, but they're not as high as you might want right now. And say, throw in an extra die, but that's the reason why you get the extra die is that this is a guard. You recognize this guy from before he was in the guard and before you were in this crew. And that means that regardless of if you succeed or fail, this person has now seen that it was you and they know who you are.
Yeah.
So you can have situations like that where you actually bribe the players with a mechanical boost to do the thing that you think is more interesting. And sometimes those systems build it in. That's something you could consider for Pathfinder or D&D too. Be like, you can bribe them with a hero point or inspiration, for example. Those kind of techniques can work regardless of the system you're playing with.
And I think that another thing that you can often have in these kinds of systems is an idea that in addition to the future being something that you're finding out, the past can also be something that you're finding out too. You're filling in holes in the character's backstory. You're figuring out things that the characters did in the past to plan.
That's right. So in a lot of these systems, like we were mentioning early on, there's like this ping pong of a spotlight going back and forth. The player does something, the GM responds. The player does something, the GM responds. But here's the secret of this. While you might think of it as like, oh, this is like in a play or a movie script where there's a line and then another line and a line and then another line and they go in order, in truth, for those systems, there's little difference between saying my action is, right now we're in this courtyard and I blow up the wall or then I knock down the wall because we need to get through the wall versus previously I set up, sabotage the wall so it will collapse right now. Either way, in a lot of these systems, you are taking your move. Yes, in the one case, it happened that some of the activities you took actually in the game world happened in the past, but you still roll your check now. And if you failed to bash it down now, you'd be like, well, you try to bash it down and it stays up.
That means your sabotage in the past wasn't good enough.
If you rolled for the past, exactly right.
Yeah.
You'd be like, well, you thought you had a sabotage to fall down, so you're like, the enemy guards are rushing at you, and you're like, ha-ha, as you walk up to the wall that's going to fall, and it doesn't.
There's a little poof of smoke.
There's a poof of smoke. There are a few cracks appear. It looks like it's weakened. Maybe if someone bashed it down, that would be easier, but it sure is still there, and suddenly the guards who are right behind you have cornered you. And they call out, what do you think you're doing there? What do you do?
Yeah.
That's just kind of how these things go in those kinds of systems. And so like Linda was saying about the time, like it actually shifts around those times.
And because because you have the sense that things are more flexible in the way that they're coming together, there's also an understanding that you want to be kind of generous with what characters could have done or what could have been set up.
And you can use this same style and technique in D&D and Pathfinder by allowing the players to potentially make a check, make sure they spend the right number of like actions or whatever the cost would be, so that they're not just getting free turns out of it, but to claim that something was involving like a previous plan, if that sort of makes sense for their character as a mastermind.
Yeah. Like, you have things like those feats that can give you, you can pull a consumable out of your bag in just the right moment. Things that have that sort of feel.
That's right. Sometimes it's a little harder to do that because in game systems that are very discrete, there's definitely a big mechanical difference between, like, I cast haste right now, and I did a scheme that would cause the haste effect to happen at this time, even if you're spending the actions for it either way, because the enemy couldn't counterspell the scheme necessarily or disrupt you by hitting you with the sword or whatever the situation is. So there are some limitations to your ability to do this in a Pathfinder or D&D game. On the other hand, in a lot of ways, you can still react very, very strongly to what the players are doing and train yourself up with that. Like we said before, you're going to need pieces that you can use, or just decide that you are going to use very simple maps, and then use only creatures right out of your monster manual or bestiary, NPCs from NPC books that just show up, and that you'll refluff whatever it is. That's fine too. Like, when we said get a bank of creatures and things you can use, that bank could just be a pre-published book that you've bought for that system.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a question in chat that said, did these systems grow out of systematizing how some people were playing D&D anyway? I would say that not necessarily. I think they grew out of a genuine movement to this looking for more of a narrative way of playing games, and based on more of some of the narrative. I wouldn't say competitors, because D&D is just sort of D&D, and then there's all the other games that are out there, but narrative alternative systems that even predated Apocalypse World that were out there, and they grew out of sort of that movement rather than probably out of a very reactive style of D&D. But you know what? I'm not in the heads of the people who wrote the very first games that were in this style, and it's quite possible that in fact, it's likely, at least, that even to reject the sort of more traditionalist approach of a D&D adventure, that a lot of those people might have played it sometimes in the past, and it might not be that it was they kept playing D&D with those kind of rules. It might just be they played it and they didn't like it, and they wanted to play something else.
Yeah, and they wanted to do something different, and they wanted to see, like, what would they have wanted to see in their game that they don't see in D&D, and so therefore that's what they want to make.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So, basically, the takeaway point is that play to find out what happens next is a specific type of improvisational style that is separate from a more railroaded style, a more pre-written adventure style, that is very much based on a almost, ping pong or tennis style back and forth between the player and the GM.
It's characterized by not having large amounts of pre-planning or commitment to things going in a specific direction, but instead organically developing the story so that what is shown on screen is always something that's of consequence.
Yes, and it's considered like a cardinal sin for the GM to respond in a way that is not true to the action that the player was taking, and like the roll that they got on the die for how well they did on it. Whereas the right thing to do is to speak the truth in the fiction of what happened there. Whether it was a success with consequences, you need to find appropriate consequences. If it's a success where you get away scot-free, don't add in other additional consequences that weren't supposed to be there. And if it's a failure, don't just have pity on them and give it away to them. Or if the failure is supposed to have a really bad consequence, just be like, well, it wasn't that bad. But you have to stay true to what is happening when you're doing these play to find out what happens next. Otherwise, you weren't really playing to find out what happened next in the fiction with the responses of the players and the dice rolls, but instead you were just playing to do what you decided was going to happen.
So we have a question for Bro. Can you describe some of the benefits of this style a bit more?
So, in general, what are considered to be the benefits of this style are, A, that it always follows the player's interests. So, if they get really interested in Bob the Guard, the adventure is going to go more towards Bob the Guard. So, B, and this is a big one, is that once you get good at doing this style, you don't need to pre-prep a lot, and you can do something even as complicated as a heist, which Blades in the Dark are based on and are usually the most complicated to run, and for the players, where in a lot of systems, the players spend like 2 hours deciding how they're going to do the heist, just discussing and debating in and out of character before you actually get to do anything. Whereas in Blades in the Dark, it's just like, okay, come up with a general overall plan. And this is not a specific plan. This is like, is your plan to break in? Or are you going to walk in and lie and say that you're like the exterminators for the rats? Like, it's only up to like, what is the basic gist of vaguely what you're doing here? And then then you will roll a roll at the beginning in Blades of the Dark. Now, there's only Blades of the Dark, not all of the systems that are played to find out what happened next do this, but I'm showing how this works for a heist. You roll a roll at the beginning, and that roll entirely determines whether your initial approach is so great that you have it under control at least when things are starting off, or it's a kind of generally, it was okay, but there's some concerns. Or it's like extremely tense, problematic situation where everything is going bad. And then the GM will then just narrate all the way from the beginning in a way that fits with one of those 3 world states, how it started from the beginning and then got you into this place that everything seems controlled, under control, or it's kind of generally risky, or it's super severely bad.
Yeah. So for both the players and the GMs, a higher percentage of the time is spent actively engaging with playing the game as opposed to preparing for things in advance.
That's right, because it narrated through that whole planning stage and the initial early action that can sometimes drag, and then you go right into the point where it's like, let's say you rolled that things were doing really bad. It's like, and that's when they pull all the guns on you and say, the rat exterminators just left. Or something like that.
Yeah.
So it generally means that you get more action and less dragging if you're good at dealing with these styles. It also allows players to feel like every decision matters and like their choices had real consequences and shaped the world and what was happening, rather than just being like, well, everybody who played this adventure path more or less sure did the same basic things.
Yeah. Another thing that it can help deal with is sometimes when you have players in like more of a D&D or Pathfinder style game whose character has a really high mental ability score, it can be hard to sort of bridge the gap between like how good that character is at something and how well you can step by step pull it off. Whereas with a system like this, it's much easier to set up so that, say, the mastermind planner came up with a great plan or something like that, because the GM can be more involved in describing how things work out in a way that is appropriately favorable to the character based on the strategy that the player chose and how successful they were.
That's right. So basically, it's because it's reactive, it makes the world feel living, and if you do it right and you're good at doing it, it can save you a huge amount of prep and save the draggy parts from the table, while still allowing you to run complex games where just there's a lot at stake and a lot of different possibilities for things to happen.
Yeah. Now, I will say that it is something that, it does require, I think, a slightly greater degree of trust between the players and GMs that everyone is going to be engaging in good faith. Compared to, as we've talked to some in the past, where some players are like, well, it needs to be run by the module so that I know that it's fair and things like that. In this case, things are going to be adaptive. They are going to be reactive. So, you're going to want to make sure that as the GM, that you're setting those challenges in a fair way.
That's right. And you know what? Linda talked about being in good faith. With these kinds of systems, there is a large portion of possibility space where you were in completely good faith as the GM, but you still maybe didn't live up to the standards that the system has for, or that your players have for what feels like it's the appropriate response. And that's just because it's hard for some people. Some people find it easy as a fish breathing underwater, whereas some people find it as easy as a human breathing underwater.
And it's because also the GM doesn't have as much pre-work put into it. It falls more to the players to decide what they're going to do, and in so doing, indicate what's important. So it's a little bit of a perspective shift in that regard.
So possibly Neil suggests that if you wanted to do a Pathfinder 2 Blades in the Dark style play to find out what happens, you could have an ad hoc victory point system where it's just very reactive. Whatever they say, you're just always gathering up victory points. You're right, possibly, Neil. In fact, to be perfectly honest with you, it's in a different format, so it looks different because it has these little clocks. But the Blades in the Dark style infiltration system kind of does have almost a victory point system. But it's just, the clocks are basically little containers for victory points that fill up or deplete as the clock moves along. And if it's a good clock and you filled it up all the way, then good things happen. If it's a bad clock, for like the guards have gotten here, then the guards have gotten here. So really, if you think about it, a lot of these systems do have mechanics that are similar that can map onto the Pathfinder 2 victory point system if you decided to use very much a victory point system, but in this play to find out what happens style where the players just say whatever they want, you give an appropriate response to it, and based on their roles and their decisions, you're building up different kinds of victory points.
And Rohit was saying it seems like it's much easier as a player than as a GM. I think it probably depends on your GM style too. Like, I personally am a very prep-minded GM, so GMing that sort of thing is something that comes as naturally to me.
I usually GM when Linda and I are doing Blades in the Dark, for example. It actually can be tricky for some players, though, because of the fact that some players want this more structured approach where they're kind of being guided by the hand towards what they know the thing is obviously supposed to be, and where when you throw the spotlight on them, because it's like it's up to them to make a move, and you say that, what do you do? They might not know. They might freeze up. Maybe they were on their phones, especially if it's someone who's like kind of tuned out somewhat, but they can sort of follow along, especially since it's so railroaded in whatever adventure you're running that they always know what the general next thing is going to be well enough. That kind of player might have difficulty too. It's not only the GM, but I will agree with you on that. That whoever said that in chat, Rohit, I will agree with you, Rohit, that the person who is most likely to be like, I just can't do this very well, this is tricky, is the GM.
Yeah. I mean, players can help also by, maybe the player could also ask a question about the area, or, if they're not sure.
So Math Guy Dave has a question that says, what recommendations do we have for a system that has the best materials for if you're trying to learn to play this way? And I'm going to interpret that to mean for someone who doesn't know how and thinks that they might have trouble. Because any of these systems will be fine if you were hearing this and you're like, this sounds like it won't be too bad. It probably won't. But of the ones that I have seen, I would probably suggest Daggerheart I play D&D and Pathfinder. I know them in and out. This sounds cool, but it might sound hard. The reason for that is that Daggerheart has some crunchy elements that you can tie into, but more so that it has a few guidelines, like the ones I mentioned earlier on, where it's like, well, you've got these abilities to just kind of seize control of the narrative and have the bad guys do something based on your number of fear points, which could be like 20 or 30, but then it tells you, use about this many. And when you have, and that's our guideline. It gives the book continually gives little tips like that of how to use things, which most of the games that are in this style are a little hesitant to do because they want you to develop your own idiom completely.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I think and the fact that it just looks more approachable to a D&D or Pathfinder player, I think it's an excellent
So does it have
point.
kind of like what kind of challenge, some guidance for like what kind of challenge might this thing be? Like, what kind of thing you might roll?
This is
and,
a random encounter that
yeah.
you're just passing by.
Yeah.
Like, even if you have more points, don't spend more than this many usually.
Mm-hmm.
But you might decide that you did because you kept messing up everything you tried to do.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing interesting was happening. The PCs didn't even feel like this was an encounter, so I'll spend one more on it, whatever.
And I think you'd often have some kind of a concept of like, this is an easy thing, this is a moderate thing, this is a hard thing, or this is a very hard thing, and then like some kind of a sense of what kind of difficulty level that is and what you need to roll to succeed.
That's right. So Rico points out another example of a situation where it can be tough for players is when they players who like to know because the system tells them what the consequences for their action will probably be versus players who the GM says, what do you do? And they decide to do something and then they have literally no clue what move the GM will make, and it causes them to be nervous or just feel like they are like less able to understand what's going on. That was what Rico was mentioning in chat. That is also a good example of a player-based situation where you could have more issues with it. And that is sort of a dynamic situation as well, because if you have the GM who is like the hypothetical golden, like descended from Nirvana to give you an experience in this game system, maybe they did it so perfectly that every time you're like, that's exactly what I thought would have happened if I tried to do this thing and got a partial success with consequences.
I think though the one thing that would be useful to talk about, whether that's as a part of session 0 or just kind of the fundamental assumptions of the game system, is a general sense of the lethality of the game. Because I think that, there are certain consequences that players tend to fear more than others. Like character death and characters losing large numbers of important resources. So if you're kind of on the same page about when that sort of thing could come out, then I think that it goes a long way to dealing with the worrying about like, oh gosh, what is this going to do here?
And some of these systems, like Apocalypse World, are brutal, and you're probably gonna die. Some of them, like Daggerheart, you literally, when you go to 0, you have 3 choices. And this is somewhat similar to Fabula Ultima and other systems too. But in Daggerheart, your choices are die immediately, get to it as you're dying, do an immediate, like, super awesome thing that automatically, like, crits out. That's option 1. Option 2, you definitely live. In fact, you cannot be harmed. Even if the next thing that happens in the scene is that a nuclear explosion of magic kills everyone in the entire world, you will survive because you cannot be killed at this point. You were probably shunted to another plane at that point. But you gain a permanent like scar, which doesn't have to be a physical one, but that like weakens your character's maximum hope by 1, and you're out of this scene. You will not be healed back into it. You're safe, but you're out. Option 3. Let the dice decide. You have a slightly greater than 50% chance to come back into the fight, which if you crit that roll, you come back with full hit points. If you fail with the slightly less than 50% chance, you're dead. You do not get to do a heroic last thing. You're just dead.
Yeah.
And when Critical Role, who were, they're associated with Daggerheart, like their publishing company are the ones who made it, they ran it, and there were 2 people who got to the 0 hit points, and they both chose to roll.
And what happened?
They both survived, I think.
Yeah.
But they could have both died, and but then they chose it, and so that gave them some player choice there. I think that's good for the perspective that you were talking of about like giving some options to help put your life in your hands when it comes to that. And
Mika was saying it's more like mismatched expectations. So it sounds like it wasn't so much about like is this going to kill my character, but more of like oh, I didn't think this one was a bit, this didn't seem like it was a high stakes check, but then suddenly.
And one of the things that helps, obviously, there can be an issue because your GM is told to make something up and they decide what they think it is. But if you have a system like Blades in the Dark where the consequences when you fail with a consequence, it depends. Were you controlled? In those situations, if the situation was under control, the consequence is usually that the situation is no longer under control, but nothing else. Usually not much else. If it was in the middle risky zone, something bad could happen, but often, like, if it's really bad, it just takes a clock that's toward the bad thing happening instead of it happening right away. And if you're in the desperate, then the consequences are supposed to be really bad. And you would know, because the GM has to tell you.
Yeah, so then you know what the level of stakes are.
Our stakes are desperate, our stakes are risky, our stakes are controlled. So you would know you were rolling a check that you had a decent chance of failing in a desperate situation. In fact, you gain 1 XP every time you roll in a desperate in Blades in the Dark. So if you survive rolling constantly desperate, you could actually wind up leveling up faster.
And I think, too, because talking about, like, intent matters so much, pressing A to interact with the cat instead of petting it, you kick it.
Yeah, so I think hopefully in a play to find out what happens next, you would rarely have that situation. It does sometimes happen. Pressing A to interact with the cat where you kick instead of pet it. Or, like, to give an example from our gaming history, in the game Tales of the Arabian Nights, it's a board game, there's a option called Drink, which usually just does something vaguely water related. Like, it'd be like you jump into the ocean when you pick Drink, or like you splash water into someone's face or something like that. So, of course, when Linda saw a character who was going on an adventure in the Arabian Nights, saw that there was a building on fire,
like,
she said, okay, I'm going to pick Drink.
Because I think that's the most likely
that's probably
to be
like, I grab a bucket and put out the fire, right? Start a bucket brigade. And so I flipped to the page for that option, and now there are 3 possibilities. So maybe one of them really was that. But the one that Linda rolled on the die out of those 3, I flipped to, and it's like, as the building is burning and the people scream out and they look for help, you calmly take out a water flask from your pocket. You kind of look at them, you nod, and you drink it down. And all of the villagers, like, glare at you in hatred, and you've become scorned. And Linda was like, what? No, I wanted to help them. I didn't want to just drink like a jerk in front of them as they're burning down. She had to do a pilgrimage to Mecca. It was a whole thing. That was a game where Linda's character was just much better than mine, and she just legitimately had way higher score than I did, but because she was forced to do the pilgrimage to Mecca from being scorned, and you cannot win until you complete the pilgrimage to Mecca, my crappy character managed to barely scrape the victory condition and end the game while she was dealing with her burning.
But yeah, I think that there's also more of a sense that, like, there's not quite as clear of a division between, like, this is exactly the role of the GM. The GM presents and decides the world. This is exactly the role of each player. Like, the GM is going to be more involved in what the characters do, and then the players are going to be more involved in what the world state is.
That's right. And in a situation where it's unclear, the GM is expected to ask some questions.
Yeah.
Like, if there's a situation where it's like, there's a building's on fire, what are you going to do? And Linda was like, water. And then the GM would say, okay, but what are you going to do with the water? Are you drinking it while the building's on fire?
I was like,
and
no.
She's like, no, I'm going to use it to put out the fire. I was like, okay.
Yeah. So there can be a conversation where you try to, like, ascertain what the other person is going for. And of course, just like any game, you know, if the GM's describing something and the player's like, wait a minute, that's not what I meant at all, then you can always, like, go back and be like, oh, okay.
And during that conversation is when, for instance, in Blades in the Dark, you would ask about a devil's bargain. Like, if you didn't even have that conversation at all, there'd be no time to ask about a devil's bargain. Is anybody helping you? Anything like that. When you're assembling the dice. So, like, in a lot of these systems, there's naturally an expectation. There's a bit of a conversation rather than just the player just declaring one of, like, the skills that are on their sheet. Like, you wouldn't just in Blades in the Dark just be like, proud.
Thievery.
Yeah, you wouldn't be like prowl.
And it's like, okay.
Okay, I know your thing on prowl says you've got the most dots on prowl.
But what are you actually doing?
Prowl.
Okay, but where and how and what is your goal?
I'm prowling prowlily towards the goal.
Okay, well, what is your goal?
Whatever we're here for. The thing, the MacGuffin. I'm prowling it.
Yeah.
So you don't like you would try to like tease out exactly what you're doing beyond that point. Also, in a lot of these systems, to be clear, the GM asks, what do you do? And the player says what they do, but the GM, like, pretty much never says, okay, now you need to roll an Arcana check. The GM doesn't tell them what they're doing or tell them what the appropriate check is. The player decides what they're doing, and from there, the check is determined. So, if the player says, yeah, I'm going to study these arcane runes, in some of the systems, by the way, if Arcana was a skill, the GM would not even at that point be allowed to say, that sounds like an Arcana check. But if they say, I'm going to study arcane runes with prowl, then the GM might be like, would be allowed to say, I don't know if that sounds like you're prowling, though. Maybe if you want to prowl, do something else.
Yeah.
So there's going to be some degree of conversation and back and forth.
Can you explain generally how prowl could be relevant to
studying these arcane runes? Because Arcana is the skill that has the study arcane runes sub.
No, you're not allowed to say that.
Yeah, that's true.
We were making fun a little bit.
There you go.
When we were playing of like, oh, you can't say what skill.
That's right. You'd be like, I was looking through the actions, and there is one that has a sub action called Study Arcane Runes, and it isn't Prowl, though I'm not going to say which one it is. Alright, so I think what we've come through in the end, and hopefully in answering these questions we had in chat from our real D&D and Pathfinder player audience, so if you're a D&D or Pathfinder player who's watching this, you could thank the audience for these great questions. This will help you understand what this philosophy is, how it's used in the games that are built upon it, and how you can use it in your D&D and Pathfinder game to make a really interesting and different experience. Even if it's not for you every time, it might be a great way to do a particular single adventure or to just flex those muscles and see if they actually make you a little bit better of a GM, even when you're running a traditional adventure for D&D and Pathfinder 2.
Thanks so much for joining us, everybody.
All right. So please like or subscribe and even join us if you with like the join button if you want to support us. We're going to give you XP, but please vote for the next episode that is on Tuesday.
I see a vote for 5 and a vote for 1. Also,
there has been a vote for 5.
Also, there was an other.
And what
topic,
was the other?
how to run recurring villains.
How to run recurring villains. Okay, so we're going to make 6 be recurring villains.
And let's check who voted up at the top to make sure we...
Yes, but we're also going to give some
already?
XP to all our excellent viewers. So we've got a 3666. All right, well, Satan wins.
Wait, was one of the 6s a change from a previous vote, though? 3.
Let me see.
So Math Guy was 5, David was 1. Okay.
Yes, we got 5-1-3-3-6-6-6.
Oh, Math Guy changed, so it's 4 6s.
Now it's 4 6s.
And 1 1. Okay, yeah.
All right, we're going to do recurring villains. So, if you want to see those villains come back to fight another day, be sure to come on Tuesday. And remember, Saturday, we're going to be building a monster. So, if you have any concept for a monster, think about it. You've got some days, and that monster might be built in real time together with chat. So, take care, everyone, and we'll see you for monster building and recurring villains. Bye!
Bye!